The man had no real place to sleep anymore. Every night he searched for a corner that felt a little safer than the rest. Sometimes it was under a bridge, sometimes behind closed shops, and sometimes near the old bus stop where few people passed after midnight. The city was loud all day, but at night it became quiet in a way that felt heavy. Cold winds moved across the streets, carrying dust, plastic, and the smell of smoke and food from faraway places. His clothes were old and worn. The shoes on his feet had tiny holes, and water entered easily when it rained. His jacket was thin and no longer warm enough for winter nights. His face showed signs of struggle-long days without proper rest and meals. Many people saw him, but very few truly noticed him. To most, he was just another homeless man sitting on the side of the road, with a small bag beside him. But what no one could see was the music still alive inside him, long before he lost everything. Music had been his world. The piano had once been his closest friend. He didn't remember the exact moment his life began to fall apart, but he remembered the sounds. The simple notes. The soft melodies. The way the piano made him feel alive. Even now, with nothing in his hands, his fingers still moved sometimes in the air, as if he were pressing invisible keys. During the day, he stayed near busy streets. People passed in a rush, their eyes fixed on their phones or the road ahead. Some dropped coins into his small cup without looking at him. Some avoided him completely. A few children stared with curiosity before their parents pulled them away. And then there were those who laughed. "Get a job," someone once shouted from across the street. Another man walked past and said, "You should be ashamed of yourself." Each word hit him like a stone, but he never answered back. He had learned long ago that explaining his story changed nothing. People had already decided who he was just by looking at him. At night, when the city slowed down and the noise became softer, he allowed himself to remember. He remembered sitting in front of a real piano. He remembered clean hands moving across polished keys. He remembered applause, though he wasn't sure whether that memory was real anymore or just something his heart had created to survive. Sometimes, on very quiet nights, he would sit alone and softly tap his fingers on his knee, pretending it was a keyboard. In his mind, the music was clear, every note perfect. His eyes would close, and for a few moments the street disappeared. He was no longer cold or hungry. He was back where he belonged. But when his eyes opened again, reality returned fast. One morning, the sky was cloudy, and a light drizzle covered the roads with a thin layer of water. He walked slowly through the streets, dragging his tired feet. His stomach hurt from hunger. He had not eaten proper food since the day before. Small coins in his cup were not enough to buy anything filling. Still, he kept walking. As he turned into one of the busier areas of the city, something caught his eye. A crowd had gathered near the large open square where street performances often happened. People stood in a circle, holding phones, smiling and clapping. Music floated through the air. It was a piano. A big black piano stood in the middle of the square. A young performer had just finished playing, and the crowd cheered loudly. The man stopped walking. His heart began to beat faster, not with fear, but with something he had not felt in a long time, hope mixed with pain. He stood at a distance, not daring to go closer. He watched as one performer after another took turns. Some were good, some were average, and some were only there for fun. The crowd enjoyed all of them. The man watched silently from the side, his eyes locked on the piano keys. His fingers twitched. His mind whispered, "Just one chance." But reality answered quickly, "Look at you." He lowered his eyes to his clothes, his hands, his shoes. Then he looked at the laughing crowd. None of them knew who he was or what he had once been. To them, he was only what he looked like now. Still, the feeling inside him grew stronger with every song. By the time the last performer finished and stepped away, his heart was beating so hard that he could hear it in his ears. The organizer stood near the piano, calling for the next person. The man hesitated. His feet felt heavy. Sweat formed on his palms. A voice in his head told him not to do it. It told him he would be humiliated. It told him he would be laughed at again. But another voice, quiet yet stubborn, told him he might never get this chance again. Slowly, step by step, He moved forward. People began to notice him as he came closer. Their smiles faded. Some whispered to each other. A few covered their noses. One person laughed loudly and pointed at his clothes. Is he serious? Someone said. The organizer looked confused. What do you want? He asked. The man swallowed hard. His voice was weak from long silence, but he forced the words out. May I play for a moment? The crowd reacted instantly. Some laughed. Some shook their heads. One person shouted, This is a performance area, not a shelter. Another said, You'll ruin it. The organizer hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. I'm sorry, he said. This piano is for registered performers. The man nodded slowly, his face burning with shame. He turned as if to leave, but something made him pause. All the years of music, all the pain, all the nights of invisible playing, it was too much to silently walk away from. I only need 1 minute, he said softly. Just one. The crowd mocked him. One person clapped sarcastically. Yeah, sure. Let the street star perform. The man lowered his head. The ground in front of him looked blurry as his eyes filled with tears he had learned not to shed in front of people. His hands shook. He felt every pair of eyes judging him. He waited for the organizer to say no again, but before that could happen, a quiet voice came from the crowd. Let him try. People turned to see who had spoken. It was someone standing near the back, not looking rich or important, just ordinary. That one sentence cut through the noise. The organizer looked around. The crowd grew restless. Some wanted to see what would happen. Some were already taking out their phones, ready to record a failure. With all this mess, why not? Someone said. The organizer sighed. 1 minute, he said. Just one. The man could hardly believe what he heard. His legs felt weak as he walked toward the piano. Each step felt unreal, like a dream he might wake up from at any moment. He reached the bench and stopped. For a second he hesitated again. What if his hands no longer remembered? What if time had stolen the one thing he loved? Slowly he sat down. The crowd was quiet now, but it was not a respectful silence. It was the silence people keep when they expect something to go wrong. His fingers hovered above the keys. He took a deep breath, and that is where his invisible life on the streets met the one thing that had never truly left him: music. The man's hands hovered above the piano keys. He could feel the cold metal in his fingers, the smoothness of the black and white keys beneath his palms. For a moment he froze. The noise of the city felt far away, as if time itself had stopped. All he could hear was his own heartbeat, fast and nervous, and the whispers of the crowd that now surrounded him. Some faces were curious, some mocking, and some clearly impatient. He had not played in public for years. The last time he sat at a real piano, the audience had been different. They had applauded, smiled, and listened. Now, every eye was on him, and most of them expected failure. That thought made his stomach twist. He could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on him, heavier than the worn coat on his shoulders. He looked at the piano once more, the black and white keys shining under the afternoon sun. His fingers itched to move. He remembered the notes, the patterns, the songs that had once come effortlessly. But would they still come now? Would the music still live inside him? The fear of forgetting, of making a fool of himself, pressed against his chest. A child in the crowd tugged at their parent's sleeve and whispered, "He's dirty. Why is he playing?" The parent did not answer. The man took a deep breath. He could feel the whispers, the pointing fingers, the smirks. Yet inside, something stronger began to rise. It was not anger or pride. It was something quiet, stubborn, and old hope. Slowly he pressed a single key. The sound was soft, almost hesitant. A low note echoed, trembling through the square. He waited, listening. The crowd shifted, unsure. Some raised their eyebrows. Some laughed. One man muttered, "Here we go, another disaster." He closed his eyes. He did not think about the crowd, about the judgment, or about the ridicule. He thought only about the music. The melodies he had carried inside his mind for years. The fingers that remembered what his mind sometimes forgot. Slowly he pressed another key. Then another. Each note grew stronger, more confident. The first melody that came to him was simple, soft, and sad. It was not flashy or complicated. It was a song that told a story of pain, of nights spent cold and hungry, of being unseen and unheard. Yet somehow the music was beautiful. It carried emotion that words could never hold. His hands moved more freely now, the trembling fading. Each key he pressed was like a word in a story, each chord a sentence that reached out to the people around him. Some in the crowd leaned in closer, their laughter fading. The child who had whispered earlier now stared wide-eyed. The parents shifted uncomfortably. The murmurs of doubt were slowly replaced by quiet awe. The man did not notice the change. He was lost in the music. The city around him disappeared. The people around him disappeared. It was just him, the piano, and the notes flowing through his hands. The music was his escape, his voice, and his way of surviving. Memories surfaced as he played. He remembered a small room with sunlight streaming through a window, the smell of old wood and polish. He remembered hours spent practicing, learning each note, each rhythm, each emotion. He remembered applause, smiles, and the pride of knowing he had worked hard to create something beautiful. Now, the memories mixed with the present, and the music carried them all pain. Joy, longing, and hope. The notes grew louder, richer, more alive. His fingers danced across the keys with a confidence that surprised even him. Every person watching could feel it. The people who had mocked him were silent now, their expressions unreadable. They had expected failure, but what they were witnessing was something entirely different. A man standing near the back whispered to his friend, "Is he really that good?" The friend shook his head slowly, unable to speak. Others felt it too. The music did not just sound beautiful, it told a story. It spoke of struggle, of survival, of hope that refuses to die. No matter how harsh life may be, the man's mind drifted for a moment, and he almost forgot he was being watched. He did not play for the crowd or for recognition. He played because he could not stop. The piano was his language. The keys were his words. Each melody was a sentence, each chord a paragraph. He spoke without saying a word. People around him began to shift, leaning closer, holding their breath. Some phones appeared, capturing the moment, but even they could not capture the feeling. The music was bigger than a screen, bigger than a video. It was alive, breathing through him and into the open air. Touching hearts in a way that silence never could. A woman in the crowd covered her mouth. Her eyes filled with tears. She could not explain why, but something in the music reached her deep down. The child who had been curious moments ago now sat quietly on the ground, unable to look away. Even the skeptics felt the pull of the melody, the emotion behind each note. The man continued to play. He no longer counted time. One song flowed into the next. He improvised, letting his fingers move freely, guided by memory and emotion. Every chord carried a story. Every pause carried tension. Every flourish carried hope. The city seemed to fade around him, leaving only the piano, the notes, and the story he had waited so long to tell die now. The crowd had grown. People stopped walking, people who had not planned to see anything at all. They stopped in their tracks, drawn to the music. Even those who had mocked him earlier could not turn away. The whispers had vanished. All that remained was silence, filled with the sound of a man's heart on the keys. Someone in the crowd dared to clap softly after a particularly beautiful passage. The sound startled him for a moment. He opened his eyes, realizing that people were watching in awe. The applause grew, hesitant at first, then stronger. Some were crying, some were smiling, some simply stared, unable to move. He felt something inside him shift. For the first time in a long time, he did not feel invisible. For the first time, his music made people stop. His music made them listen. His music made them feel. And in that moment, he remembered something he had forgotten: the power of the piano. The power of music, the power of expressing the heart when no one else could hear it. The final notes rang out, long and soft, echoing through the square. The man paused, his hands hovering above the keys. He could feel the silence around him, thick and heavy, as if the city itself was holding its breath. He lowered his hands slowly, afraid to break the spell. The crowd remained quiet. There was no laughter, no mocking, no judgment. Just stillness. And then, slowly, softly, the first claps began. One person, then another. Applause built gradually until it became a wave, sweeping through the square. People cheered, some shouted, some whistled. The man could not help but smile faintly. He had expected ridicule, humiliation, maybe even anger. Instead, he found respect, awe, and the first warmth of recognition he had felt in years. The child clapped the loudest, eyes wide with wonder. The woman who had been crying wiped her tears, smiling gently at him. Even the people who had laughed before now stood in silence, uncertain how to respond, amazed at what they had just heard. The man stood slowly. His hands shook slightly from the effort, from the nerves, from the flood of emotions that had washed over him. He looked at the piano, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of belonging. He was still standing on the streets. He was still wearing his old, worn clothes. But in that moment, he was more than the world had ever seen him as. He was a musician, a storyteller, and a human being who refused to be invisible. Someone approached him with a small smile, holding out a hand. "That was incredible," they said softly. "I don't even know what to say." The man nodded, unable to speak. Words were not enough. The music had said it all, and for the first time that day he felt a small spark of hope. A spark that maybe life could offer him more than cold nights and empty streets. A spark that maybe, just maybe, his story was only beginning. The man sat back down at the piano, feeling a mix of fear and excitement. The first time he had played that day, he had been nervous and unsure, but now, something inside him had shifted. The applause, the silence that followed, the awe in people's faces, it gave him a strange kind of courage. He wasn't just a homeless man in their eyes anymore. He was someone who could touch hearts through music. That thought alone was both frightening and thrilling. He glanced at the crowd. They were still watching him, still holding their breath. Some whispered to one another, some pointed excitedly, and some just stared, unable to look away. He could see surprise in their eyes, disbelief, and even a little respect. For the first time in years, he felt seen not for his clothes, his appearance, or his situation, but for who he truly was inside. He pressed his fingers on the keys gently, feeling the familiar coldness beneath his fingertips. He started with soft notes, almost like a whisper. The melody began slowly, delicate, cautious, as if he were testing the waters. But this time, he did not let fear control him. He let the music flow naturally, letting his emotions guide him. Every note he played carried a story. Some were memories of his childhood, filled with laughter and the innocence of simpler days. Others were darker, memories of loss, of hunger, of nights sleeping on cold streets. The music was his voice when words failed. It told a story of struggle, pain, and survival. Yet, amidst the sadness, there was hope, a quiet, resilient hope that refused to be silenced. The crowd reacted slowly at first. Some nodded their heads gently, feeling the music. Some closed their eyes as if letting the melody reach places words never could. A few people wiped tears from their eyes. There was something raw, something real about the way he played. It wasn't about technique or fame. It was about emotion, about truth. A little boy tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom, he's amazing," he whispered. The mother smiled, squeezing his hand, but she didn't speak. Her eyes were fixed on the man, following every movement of his hands on the keys. Even those who had laughed earlier now stood silently, unsure how to respond, caught between shock and admiration. The man's fingers moved faster now. The melody grew richer, more complicated, but never forced. Every chord told a story, every pause added tension. He was no longer just playing music. He was sharing a piece of himself with everyone around him. He could feel the energy of the crowd, the shift in their attention, and it pushed him to go further. A woman in the front row wiped her tears, overwhelmed by the emotion in the music. She had seen many performances in her life, but nothing like this. There was no pretense, no showmanship, no desire to impress, just raw, heartfelt expression. The music reached deep into her, reminding her of the beauty that can exist even in pain. Some young men who had been mocking him earlier now looked embarrassed. They whispered to each other, unsure what to say. I didn't expect that," one muttered. Another shook his head slowly, muttering, "He's incredible." The man didn't hear them. He was lost in the music, lost in the moment, lost in himself. He moved through different melodies, each one telling a different part of his life. Some were soft and gentle, almost fragile. Others were bold and strong, carrying the weight of his struggles and triumphs. Each note connected with the people in the crowd in a unique way. Some felt joy, some felt sorrow, and some felt a mixture of both. The music was speaking directly to them, bypassing words, reaching their hearts in ways nothing else could. He paused briefly, letting the final chord of a soft melody linger in the air. The silence that followed was thick, full of anticipation. People waited, unsure if he would stop or continue. And then he began again, this time with more confidence, more strength. His hands flew across the keys, creating a lively, energetic melody that made people sway and tap their feet. Laughter and smiles replaced tears, but the emotion was no less real. The contrast between the soft, emotional melodies and the lively, energetic ones showed the depth of his talent. He could make people cry, make them smile, make them sit still and listen or move and dance. Every emotion, every feeling was captured in the music. And the people could feel it. They could feel his life, his struggles, and his victories through the sound. A man in the back whispered to a friend, "I didn't believe it at first. I thought he was just some homeless guy trying to get attention. But listen to him. He's amazing." The friend nodded, unable to take his eyes off the piano. Others around them nodded as well, some with tears in their eyes, some with wide, open mouths in disbelief. The man didn't stop to look at them. He didn't need to. Their reactions were enough to keep him going, enough to fuel his performance. He felt alive in a way he hadn't felt for years. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a man without a place, without respect, without hope. He felt like he belonged, like he had a purpose. He played for what felt like hours, though in reality it was probably less than half that time. Time had lost meaning in that square. All that mattered was the music, the connection, and the story he was telling. Every note, every chord, every pause was intentional. Every movement of his hands carried emotion, truth, and life. The crowd grew larger as word spread. People stopped to watch, drawn by the sound, drawn by the story, drawn by the man who seemed to transform the piano into something magical. Some people recorded videos, but even they could not capture the emotion, the depth, or the raw honesty of the performance. It was something that had to be felt, not seen. By the time he slowed to the final melody, the crowd was completely silent again, holding their breath, waiting for the last note. The man's hands hovered above the keys, and then he pressed them one final time. The note echoed through the square, soft, lingering, and full of emotion. He took a deep breath, slowly lifted his hands, and sat back. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The silence was heavy, almost reverent. And then, slowly, the applause began. One person clapped, then another, then a few more. The sound built, grew louder, until the entire square was filled with cheering, clapping, and shouting. People whistled, stomped their feet, and shouted words of praise. The man felt tears sting his eyes. He had expected ridicule, mocking, and laughter. Instead, he had found respect, admiration, and awe. People who had judged him without knowing him now looked at him differently. People who had ignored him for years now listened. People who had dismissed him had finally seen. A woman stepped forward from the crowd, holding out her hand. "That was incredible," she said softly. "I've never felt anything like that before." The man nodded, unable to speak. Words were not enough. The music had said everything for him. Even the child who had been curious at the start now looked at him with wide eyes and a smile. "I want to learn music too," the child whispered to their parent. The parent nodded, smiling. The man saw them and felt a warmth in his heart, a feeling he hadn't felt in years. The applause continued, growing louder as people clapped and shouted their appreciation. Some cried, some smiled, some were simply amazed. And the man, for the first time in a long time, felt alive, truly alive. The streets, the cold nights, the hunger, and the pain, all of it seemed distant now. For this moment he had music, and the world was listening, and as the crowd slowly began to disperse, many still whispering in awe, the man sat quietly at the piano, his hands resting gently on the keys. He knew that life would still be hard, that challenges still awaited him, but he also knew something else, something stronger. He knew that he had touched hearts that day. He had reminded people, and himself, that even someone who seems invisible, broken or forgotten, can create beauty, inspire emotion, and leave a mark that lasts far longer than appearances or circumstances. For the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. For the first time in years, he felt seen. Not for his clothes, not for his situation, not for his struggles, but for his heart, his soul, and his talent. And that feeling, small as it may have seemed to others, was everything he needed to keep moving forward. The man sat at the piano, the applause still ringing in his ears. His hands hovered above the keys for a moment, feeling the smoothness and coldness of each one. The crowd around him had grown silent again, holding their breath as if they could sense that something extraordinary was about to happen. Even those who had mocked him before now watched with wide eyes and quiet curiosity. He could feel their attention, heavy and expectant, like a gentle pressure urging him forward. For a moment he closed his eyes and let his mind drift. He remembered a time long ago, before the streets, before the hunger, before the loneliness, when he had played in a small room with sunlight streaming through a window. He remembered the warmth of the piano, the sound of the notes echoing in the room, the joy of creating something that could touch hearts. That memory reminded him of who he was and what he had lost. But it also reminded him of what he could still give. He opened his eyes and placed his fingers on the keys. This time he did not start slowly. He began with a bold chord, strong and confident. The sound echoed through the square, catching the attention of even those who had been far away. People stopped walking, phones were lifted, and the murmurs of the crowd disappeared. The music demanded attention, and everyone gave it willingly. The melody he played was different this time. It was alive, full of energy, emotion, and strength. It told the story of struggle, of nights spent hungry and cold, of moments when he had felt invisible to the world. But it also spoke of resilience, of hope, and of the power to rise even when everything seemed lost. Each note carried a part of his soul, each chord a fragment of his story. As he played, people began to lean forward, captivated. A woman in the front row pressed her hands to her chest, tears streaming down her face. A man behind her whispered to his friend, "I can't believe it. He's telling his whole life through music." The child who had been curious since the beginning now sat on the ground, eyes wide, unable to look away. Even those who had laughed and mocked him before now felt the weight of every note, and they could not deny the talent, passion, and emotion in his playing. The man's fingers danced across the keys, moving faster and more confidently with each passing moment. He played melodies that were soft and delicate, then suddenly strong and powerful. He shifted effortlessly between emotions, creating a story that the crowd could feel but could not put into words. Some parts made people smile, some parts made them sigh, and some parts brought tears to their eyes. It was a performance that touched everyone differently, yet it touched everyone deeply. A group of teenagers who had been standing at the back, skeptical at first, now whispered to each other in awe. "Did you see that?" "He's incredible," one said. Another shook his head slowly. "I never expected this." "He's amazing." Even the organizers and the staff who had doubted him now watched in silence, unable to look away. The music had transformed him, not just in their eyes, but in the energy of the square itself. The man didn't notice the crowd anymore. He was lost in the music, lost in the story he was telling with each chord and melody. He was no longer the man who had been laughed at, the man who had begged for a chance. He was a musician, a storyteller, and an artist. Every note was deliberate, every pause intentional, every flourish filled with meaning. The music was no longer just sound, it was life, emotion, and truth. At one point, he paused briefly, letting the last chord linger in the air. The silence that followed was almost sacred. People held their breath, waiting for what would come next. And then he began again, this time with a new energy. The notes were faster, more intricate, yet still full of feeling. They weaved a story of triumph, of rising above hardship, of finding strength when the world seemed to have turned its back. The crowd was mesmerized. Some people closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. Some whispered to one another, unable to believe what they were hearing. A woman in the middle of the crowd wiped tears from her cheeks and smiled, feeling a connection to the man and his music that she could not explain. Even the child at the front now clapped softly in rhythm. Completely absorbed by the performance, the man moved seamlessly between melodies, each one telling a different part of his story. Some were joyful, light, and playful, while others were heavy, sad, and full of longing. He played with precision but also with emotion, allowing the crowd to feel every note. People around him began to realize that this was not just talent, it was genius. It was something rare and beautiful, something that came from a lifetime of experience. Struggle and passion. A man in the crowd whispered, "He's telling his life through music. Every note, every chord. It's all him." Others nodded, unable to speak, simply letting the music fill them. The energy in the square shifted completely. Where there had once been skepticism, doubt, and ridicule, there was now respect, awe, and admiration. The man's music had not only silenced the crowd, it had transformed them. As he continued, the man felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. His hands were tired, his fingers sore, but he didn't stop. He could not stop. The music had taken over, becoming a force beyond him. It demanded to be heard, felt, and experienced. And he knew, deep down, that this was the moment he had been waiting for his entire life. The moment when the world would finally listen. Truly listen to him. The melody reached its climax. Strong, powerful, and full of emotion. Every chord was a declaration of who he was, what he had endured, and what he had to give. The crowd responded instinctively, clapping, cheering, and shouting encouragement. Some cried openly, moved by the raw honesty of the performance. Some laughed softly, overwhelmed by the beauty of the music. And some simply watched, silent and spellbound, unable to comprehend the talent they were witnessing. Finally, he slowed, letting the last notes echo gently into the air. The square was silent again, filled with the lingering power of the music. The man lifted his hands from the keys, breathing heavily. He looked around at the crowd, their faces filled with emotion, respect, and awe. For the first time in years, he felt truly seen, not for his appearance, not for his situation, but for who he was inside his talent, his heart, and his soul. The applause began slowly, a single hand clapping, then another, until it grew into a roar that filled the square. People shouted words of praise, some whistled, some cheered. The child at the front jumped up and down, clapping loudly, while adults around smiled, some wiping away tears. The energy of the crowd was electric, a mixture of amazement, joy, and respect. The man stood slowly, hands trembling, heart pounding. He looked at the piano, then at the people around him, and felt a wave of emotion he could not put into words. Years of struggle, pain, and loneliness had led to this moment. Years of being ignored, mocked, and overlooked had led to this moment. And now, at last, he had been heard, truly heard. Through the language that had always belonged to him, music. A woman stepped forward from the crowd, holding out her hand. That was incredible," she said softly. "I don't even know what to say." The man nodded, unable to speak. Words felt inadequate. The music had said everything for him. Even those who had laughed or doubted him earlier now looked at him with newfound respect. People who had ignored him for years now listened. People who had dismissed him had finally seen. And in that moment he realized something important. His life, his struggles, and his talent all mattered. They had value, and they could touch others in ways he had never imagined. The man walked slowly away from the piano, feeling the eyes of the crowd on him. He did not know what would come next or what the future held. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hope. He felt that maybe, just maybe, life could offer him more than cold streets, hunger, and loneliness. He had shown the world who he truly was, and that truth could never be taken away. As he disappeared into the crowd, people continued to talk, whisper, and marvel at what they had just witnessed. They would remember this moment for years. They would tell their friends and family. They would share videos and stories. And in doing so, they would honor not just his talent, but his courage, his resilience, and his humanity. And somewhere deep inside, the man smiled. For the first time in years, he felt alive. He felt seen. He felt that even in the darkest moments, even when the world seemed to have turned its back, there was still a chance for beauty, for recognition, for connection. And that was enough to keep going, enough to keep dreaming, enough to keep playing. After the music faded and the crowd slowly began to disperse, the man remained by the piano for a few moments, letting the energy of the day settle around him. The applause, the cheers, the stunned silence, it all replayed in his mind like a dream. He had expected mocking laughter, dismissal, and cold indifference. Instead, he had found recognition, respect, and awe. For a man who had spent so long invisible, it was almost too much to believe. He touched the keys lightly, almost gently, as if saying goodbye to an old friend. They had carried him through so many years of struggle, had been the voice he lost when the world turned away. And now, in a single afternoon, they had given him back a piece of his life. His heart felt full and heavy at the same time, a strange combination of exhaustion and exhilaration. He realized that this moment was not just about music, it was about redemption, about being seen, about reclaiming something that had been taken from him long ago. People who had watched from the start lingered, unsure whether to leave or to speak. Many approached slowly, almost cautiously, as if afraid that the spell would break if they moved too quickly. Some offered words of praise, their voices soft but genuine. "I've never heard anything like that in my life," a man said quietly. You're incredible." A woman stepped closer and said, "I wish I could express my gratitude for letting me hear that. It was perfect." He nodded, unable to speak much. Words felt small compared to the music, compared to the journey he had lived, compared to the story he had told without saying a single one. He realized that sometimes the deepest messages are the ones that don't need to be spoken. His music had spoken for him, had told his life in a way nothing else ever could, and the world had listened. A young boy who had been watching from the front tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom, he's amazing. He can do magic with the piano." The mother smiled softly, her eyes still on the man. She did not correct the boy. Magic seemed like the right word. It was not just the skill or the notes. It was the feeling, the emotion, the soul in every touch that made it seem like something beyond human. The man began to stand, stretching slightly after sitting so long. He felt the weight of exhaustion in his legs and the tension in his shoulders, but he also felt something he had not felt in a long time: possibility. He had been homeless, overlooked, and mocked for so long that he had nearly forgotten what hope felt like. Now, standing in the middle of the square, after sharing something so deeply personal, he felt it again. Fragile, but strong enough to hold on to. Some of the people who had initially laughed or doubted him approached, their expressions hesitant. I didn't expect that," one man admitted quietly. Another nodded, unable to find the right words. It was clear they were embarrassed, but also humbled. They had judged him by his appearance, his circumstances, and had been proven wrong. The man accepted their words with a gentle nod, knowing that their change of heart was part of the transformation he had just witnessed, not just in them, but in himself. A few strangers offered small gifts, a bottle of water, a snack, even a few coins. He accepted them with a quiet, "Thank you," but more than the material help. It was the acknowledgement, the human connection, that mattered. For so long, people had ignored him. Now they saw him. And seeing someone, really seeing them, could change everything. Word of the performance spread quickly. People pulled out their phones, sharing videos, telling friends, posting clips on social media. The story of a homeless man who had stunned a crowd with his piano playing began to travel far beyond the square. Some reached out to offer opportunities, places to perform, or simply a kind word. He realized that what had started as a small chance to play for a minute could ripple outward in ways he had never imagined. Despite all the attention, the man stayed grounded. He did not let the sudden admiration overwhelm him. He knew that life would still be hard. He knew that being recognized for a moment did not erase the struggles of the past. But it had opened a door that he never expected to find, and one that he intended to walk through carefully. He had been given a gift, the chance to reclaim a part of himself, to show the world the truth of who he was, and to remind himself that he still had worth, talent, and heart. He wandered slowly through the city after leaving the square. People continued to look at him differently now. There was a new respect in their eyes. Some smiled, some nodded, and some quietly whispered words of admiration as he passed. The world had not changed completely, but he had changed how it saw him. And more importantly, he had changed how he saw himself. The night fell, and he found a quiet corner, one that was familiar yet less lonely now. He set down his small bag, still feeling the echo of the day in his chest. He took a deep breath, letting the cool evening air fill his lungs. The streets were the same, the city lights glimmered as they always had, but he felt different. He carried a sense of hope that he had not felt in years, a sense that the world could see him, that life could offer more than struggle, and that his music had a power that went beyond the piano keys. As he sat quietly, he remembered the faces in the crowd, the mother and child, the woman who had cried, the skeptical men who had been humbled. He remembered the applause, the cheers, and the quiet moments when people had stopped moving just to listen. It had all been real, and it had all been for him. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to feel proud, not arrogant. Not boastful, but proud of surviving. Proud of creating, proud of being heard. Days passed, and the man's life slowly began to change. Some people who had seen him perform reached out, offering small jobs, places to stay, or invitations to perform again. He did not expect instant transformation, and he knew the streets were still part of his life, at least for now. But he felt a shift inside him, a belief that he could create opportunities, that he could move forward, and that his talent could open doors that had been closed for far too long. He continued to play whenever he could. Sometimes in the square, sometimes in small cafes, sometimes quietly in corners where only a few would notice. Each performance reminded him of the moment when the world had stopped and listened. Each performance reminded him that even in the lowest points, a person could still rise. The music became a part of his healing, a part of his growth, and a part of the story he would continue to tell through his fingers and his heart. People began to recognize him in the city. Some remembered the day he had played, and when they saw him, they smiled or nodded in respect. The world was not perfect, and life was still difficult, but he carried a new strength now. He carried the knowledge that even in the darkest moments, beauty could emerge. Even when people overlooked or dismissed him, his talent, his heart, and his persistence could shine. One evening, as he sat quietly by the piano in an empty square, he reflected on everything that had happened. The laughter, the mockery, the fear, the courage, the music, and the applause, all of it had led him to this point. He realized that his journey was not over, but he had proven something vital to himself and to the world, that no matter how invisible or forgotten someone might feel, they still have a voice, a story, and a gift worth sharing. He looked at the city around him, the streets, the lights, and the people passing by. He thought about the long nights, the hunger, the cold, the loneliness. And then he thought about the piano, the music, the connection, the awe, and the hope. Both parts of his life were real, both had shaped him, and both were necessary for him to become who he truly was. The man took a deep breath, feeling a quiet smile spread across his face. He knew he would face challenges again, that life would not suddenly become easy, that the streets would still be hard. But he also knew that he had a power inside him, a power that could touch hearts, change minds, and create beauty even in the darkest of circumstances. And that, he realized, was worth more than anything else in the world. As the city lights shimmered and the night grew quiet, he felt at peace. Not perfect peace, not total certainty, but a calm that came from knowing he had been heard, he had been seen, and he had survived. The piano had given him back a piece of himself, and in doing so, had opened a door to a future he had never imagined. He did not know exactly what awaited him, but he knew one thing for certain. He would keep playing, keep dreaming, and keep sharing his music with the world. Because now, finally, the world was listening, and with that thought, he sat back quietly, his hands resting on his knees, his heart full of hope, ready for whatever would come next. The man who had once been mocked, ignored, and invisible had finally found his voice, and it was a voice that could never be silenced again.